Welcome everybody to the final event of this year's Cork International Short Story Festival, which is in its 20th year. So this event is Richard Ford in conversation with Anthony Walton. To tell you a little bit about Anthony, he is the author of Mississippi, An American Journey, and has published in numerous journals internationally, including the New York Times and the New Yorker. And he'll be giving an introduction to Richard Ford. So I'll just pass it over to Anthony now.
Okay. Thank you, James. Okay. I think in many ways, most of what I'm about to say goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Richard Ford is a Pulitzer Prize winning author whose many awards include the 2016 Princess of Asturias Award for Literature, the 2019 Library of Congress Award for American Fiction, and the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Fiction. Born in 1944 in Jackson, Mississippi, and educated at Michigan State and the University of California, Irvine. He is the only author to have been awarded both the Pulitzer Prize and the PEN/Faulkner Award for a single novel, and that was Independence Day. He is well known for his series of 4 novels about the life of his fictional character, Frank Bascom, the sports writer, Independence Day, Lay of the Land, and the New York Times bestseller, Let Me Be Frank with You. His short story collections include Rock Springs and A Multitude of Sins, and just this year, The Run of Yourself, which contains several stories that I think are going to join the list of classics like Communist and Rock Springs. He wrote the screenplay for the film that stars Sam Shepard, Bright Angel, and his early novel, Wildlife, was adapted into a critically acclaimed 2018 film. And he recently published a memoir of his parents, Between Them. In his career, Ford has perfected a prose style that I would say descends from, first, the American giant Mark Twain, and that then comes forward through a line that features not just the obvious, such as Ernest Hemingway, but also more overlooked story masters like Sherwood Anderson. It is the American style that appears on first glance, or perhaps even more acutely, the first listen, to be merely vernacular, offhand, folks talking. But these stories, these voices, these characters, with time and study, reveal themselves to be so carefully crafted as to approach a pitch that rivals the most accomplished poetry. Ford can create characters as varied as lonesome and disoriented 16-year-olds in northern Montana, baffled career lawyers in the New Orleans suburbs, and an Irish expatriate woman slowly dying of cancer in her dream house on the Maine coast. They are among the both characters, indeed, that what I'm speaking of at the moment are only his stories, not his wildly beloved and acclaimed novels. We are honored to have him with us this evening, and I'm fortunate to be the interlocutor. So please please join me in welcoming to the Cork Short Story Festival, master story writer, Richard Ford.
Thank you. I actually think I may have been at the first of these festivals 20 years ago. So it's an anniversary for me too, to get to be here, and especially with you, Anthony.
Yes, and I think that that's an interesting place to start, because there are so many great Irish story writers, the obvious being James Joyce, Frank O'Connor, John McGahern, Edna O'Brien, William Trevor, Colin Tobin, and Anne Wright. But then when we look at Cork in particular, Dana Corkery, again, Frank O'Connor,
Indeed.
Falion, Elizabeth Bowen, and others. It has a tremendous, almost incredible tradition of story writing. And I know that many of those writers mean a great deal to you. Could you say a few words about what this Cork tradition has meant to you?
Well, it's probably a Cork tradition to Irish readers and Irish citizens. It's a long tradition that goes from the 19th century through Chekhov and de Maupassant, right through Cork and right on to Chicago and right to New Orleans and right to where I am. So, Frank O'Connor was, for me, when I was a young writer in the 60s, was my model. I've said this in public a lot in Ireland, but at the end of his magnificent war story, Guest of the Nation, there's this masterful line which comes in anything that happened to me afterwards I never felt the same about again. I thought, gee, every short story I write, I would like to be able to write that at the end. And that for me is sort of the Ur model of a short story, that you tell something which, when you tell it, causes something to happen which changes everything. At least the story avers that it changes everything. And that's I'm sure what I learned from O'Connor and from Elizabeth Bowen as well. We left out Claire Keegan, who's one of my favorite Irish writers, though she's not from Cork, but she deserves to be in that list as well.
Okay. Yes. Following on from that, I know that you're interested in helping folks understand and, shall we say, demythologize the lives of writers. For all your accomplishment and success, in many ways, to me, you're just a person who learned a trade and have since practiced that trade day after day, without a lot of thinking about it other than just doing the absolute best you could that day on your work, and then being mindful that there were commercial and business challenges that were going to come from doing that sort of work. Now, if you bear with me, that's all a preamble to this question.
To the hard part.
Now, you're in many ways one of the most successful participants of the American MFA system for training writers and sustaining writing culture. You study in a writing program. You've taught at a number of them. You and your friends and colleagues, including myself, have been in and out of them throughout your professional life. Could you reflect on that for a moment? What do you see? Do you think they help? What do you think they do well? Where do they fail?
Well, and indeed, I did teach in the Oscar Wilde Centre in Trinity College, Dublin, and was lucky to be able to do that. Europeans were very skeptical right from the beginning. Writing programs started in the United States in Iowa in the 30s for the most part. But Europeans were skeptical from the get-go about what went on in those places. And I think what they were skeptical of was that you were basically being given a template by a bunch of older writers about how you should do this. In other words, a set of black letter rules that you follow. And if you follow these rules well, then maybe you'll have a chance as a writer. That really is never what happens, as you know. The most that happens is that you have a teacher whom you may or may not regard highly, who is your reader. Just as if you were living in a garret in Montparnasse, you'd have somebody who you respected who read your work and then told you about it in candid terms. And that's what happened to me with E.L. Doctorow. He read my stories and said, well, that's good, or that's not very good, and I don't like this. And then I would ask him why, and he would tell me why, and we'd go have a drink. The other thing, though, which was in a way more important to me than anything anybody legitimately taught me about writing, was to learn how to conduct myself. I mean, in America, as you know, unlike in Ireland, to be a writer is not quite the accepted vocation that it is to be a lawyer, or to be a doctor, or to be a real estate salesman, whatever. And so there isn't a code of conduct, really, for how you deal with your colleagues, how you deal with your readers, how you deal with booksellers, how you deal with reviewers, how you deal with all these people. And that turns out to be something, as you were saying before, that turns out to be a lot of what you do. You deal with other human beings. And my teachers in California sort of gave me a model for how not to be jealous, how not to be rivalrous of other people, how not to wish my colleagues ill, how to read my colleagues with sympathy if I possibly could. In other words, how to turn the volume down on things. So in order that you get your own work done, because that's finally the most important thing. If you're rivalrous with people, if you're mad at people, if you're fighting with people, then you're spending time that you could just as well be spending with your own sentences. So that's what I learned. So I learned a little bit about how to read as a writer. I learned how to conduct myself as a writer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Now, just following on that for a moment, are there any younger story writers or more generally fiction writers who you are following with interest at the moment?
I don't think about young and not young. I don't care if anybody's young or old. In fact, being old myself, I would probably be more apt to follow older writers, because the older you get, the more you tend to fall off the table. But again, I mentioned Claire Keegan, who's just a masterful story writer. So I look for her all the time. I had a student named Emma Klein at Columbia whom I taught, whom I think is extremely good. But then I also want to champion people like Richard Bausch in the United States, and people who maybe haven't had all the luck in the world that they should have had. And so I'm generally sort of in a, I hate to use the word Catholic speaking in Ireland, but I'm sort of Catholic in my tastes. I don't care so much if someone's young. In fact, sometimes I'm even resentful if they are young and they're doing terribly, terribly well. So I'm looking out for the old parties.
Well, I was just curious about that, because I know you do not toss out a lot of blurbs. And so when you see them, sometimes it makes you wonder, And for example, Emma Klein was one person that you did blurb very warmly and helped get on her way. So,
she's a remarkable young writer. It wasn't for no reason. Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I agree. It's interesting though to see. I mean, you helped me with a wonderful blurb when I was starting out.
Maybe you can tell me this, Anthony. What's come of ZZ Packard? She's a young writer in America whom I liked really a lot about 10 years ago, and I haven't seen work of hers. She's just terrific.
Yes, I don't know her personally. I do know that she has been teaching.
Oh,
and we know what that can do.
That takes up all your time.
Yeah.
You spend your young life trying to get to be a really good writer, then you start teaching, you give it all away. Sorry to say.
Yes, yes, and in our country, I think that's a constant danger, particularly if you have a certain kind of personality that wants to have a job, so to speak.
Feed your kids.
Yes.
Feed your kids. Yeah. But also, but not so practically, but also an affection for the work of young people. I mean, I have an affection for the work of young people who come into my classes. For me, time spent in the classroom is some of the most exhilarating time of my life. Not because I'm teaching great stories, but I am teaching great stories, but because I'm getting to talk to them just as you and I are talking now. So it has a virtue.
Yes. And I have found over the years that I've learned an enormous amount from my students, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. You know, I found as a poet that something that's very fascinating to me was working with student poets. You began to learn the 50 ways, so to speak, that every poem goes wrong in the beginning. So you could stop doing that. You know, and that got me ahead a little bit.
I understand.
Yes, and so that was a benefit of teaching for me. But now, even though you were so fortunate to be able to work with Dr. You still had what we can consider a long apprenticeship. And, you know, and then even when you had your initial breakthrough with A Piece of My Heart, you still had an even longer path before you were able to establish yourself, you know, as a professional who could count on being published and read. What kept you going in those times?
My wife. Totally, my wife. And by which I mean, she always thought it was a good idea that I'd be doing this. And so when the first two books that I wrote were, that they were kindly received, but nobody bothered to go out and read them, I sort of reached a moment about 1981, which I thought, well, I've had my shot at this. And so I really need to go someplace and make a living, because Christina, my wife, was working all the time and I was not working, in the sense that I wasn't earning a paycheck. So I went to work in magazine work. And then I sort of fell out of magazine work after about a year and a half, and came back to home, to Princeton, New Jersey, where we were living. And I thought, well, I'm really only qualified to do one thing, which is to write novels. I think I'll take one more crack at it. And Christina said, good, that's a good idea, do that. But apart from that, and I really can't get very far apart from that, the other thing that kept me going was reading. I just kept on reading great literature. I'm a slow reader. I'm dyslexic, so I can't buzz through books. So when I read a book, I really pore over it. And poring over great books is the greatest enhancement that you can perform to your own work, because you can see what out there in the world is possible, what language is capable of, what transport is possible. So I kept reading. I never got disheartened about reading. I mean, I think it would be possible if you were a young writer and you weren't doing as well as you thought you should be doing, that reading would become a reproach to you. It never became a reproach to me. It was always good. And I'm talking about reading my colleagues, not just reading, Tolstoy. It's reading my colleagues, Ray Carver, Ann Beattie, Tim O'Brien, Roddy Doyle, John Banville, all of these people who are my colleagues now. I just kept on reading them, thinking to myself, well, they can do this. I should keep on trying to do this.
Well, that brings something to mind. You told me one time that one of the things that happened when you did that book that you decided to write to try again in Princeton was sports writer.
Right.
And so you told me that you decided to just sit down and put every single thing you knew into that book.
That's right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when I started writing novels, typical of all young writers, you don't know how to do it. There isn't a template. There isn't a model necessarily. You just have to kind of start with nothing and make something be. And so I did that. And I actually produced 2 credible novels when I did that. But what I realized about those novels was that they did not contain 2 of the most important things that I cared about when I read novels. I wanted my books to be very serious, and I wanted them to be funny at the same time, if I could possibly make them be. Because I have a sense of humor, as you know, and I also have a probably overdeveloped sense of seriousness, which I'm sorry about. But I had to figure out a way to get all of that onto the page. And the only way I could figure out how to do it was to, as you said, to spend a year not writing, but a year accumulating all of the raw material that I thought might fit into this book. And in the process of doing that, appraising that material and deleting that material and coming up at the end of the year with a kind of a critical mass of material out of which would come a novel, which would be The Sports Writer. But I remember when Updike died, quite a while ago now, Adam Gopnik, in his sort of elegiac piece about Updike in the New Yorker, said that Updike, and he was a friend of mine, Updike managed to get himself fully expressed. And I thought when I read that, that's what I want to do. I want to get myself fully expressed. And by that I mean, I want to get everything that I care about, everything that I think is important, everything that I think the reader might benefit from into everything I write. And so that's what I meant by that. Young writers can write books, as I did, in order to make a credible vessel, will partake only of a part of what they know. It's much harder, or maybe it's much more complicated. I don't want to say hard. It's much more complicated to make a vessel that includes everything you know. And that's what I wanted to do.
Yes, that brings up to me another thing that you said to me one time, just kind of offhandedly, which is that lots of people could be novelists if they paid attention to their reactions to things.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know sometimes you literally carry around a little notebook that you write things down in.
All the time.
Yes. And but that idea of slowing down enough to realize that, oh, that means something to me, that what I just saw, whether it's the leaves in the spring or a mother interacting with her child or something that happens at Walmart, whatever. Right. And so I think that that's something that you are extraordinary at as a writer, and then getting that into your work and how that contributes to the ballast. And
well, underneath that is a kind of an ethic. And the ethic is that life is passing us by all the time, and there's a lot of it. And we can affirm the passage of life if we pay attention to it. We can claim credibly that life is worth living in terms of how well we relish what we notice, even if we thought that what we noticed wasn't important before we noticed it. So, I mean, it's a sort of a standard rubric of realistic literature. Look at this. You think you know something about it? Let me put it in the best possible language I can put it in and bring it back to you. Maybe you'll think that it's worth noticing now. And because, you know, if you have my particular religious conviction, that's all there is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, following on all of this, then, I'm very interested in the evolution of your practice as a story writer over the last 40 or 50 years. I remember.
Has it been that long?
Unfortunately, yes. And trust me, I'm in that too, so that I feel you. I remember reading Rock Springs in a magazine as a first year at Notre Dame and being, you know, and one of the things that's always intrigued me is that you could have stayed with that American mountain, high plains landscape, you know, writing in the first person, you know, for the rest of your career. And I think everybody would have been very happy with that. But you have constantly evolved. So, as well as characters, subject matters, and settings, you know, you've also been a very astute and painstaking student of the genre as a genre, what it can and cannot accomplish. You know, for example, a few moments ago, you mentioned Demythologize, you know, and so for students of short stories, that means something.
Yes.
And you moved from these person stories that can read like vernacular poems to ultra precise third person stories that acutely and precisely render the inner states and processes of men and women. And then back again, you go back again sometimes. Can you speak to how you've thought about that over time, maybe even your education as a story writer?
Well, I can probably. First of all, nobody ever told me I couldn't do whatever I wanted to do. Nobody ever told me that there was only one way to do things. So I started off with a fairly wide open notion of what was possible. I also, because I grew up in the South and I was educated in the North, and then I've lived in New England, as you know, for a long time, I lived in the West for a long time. I came to understand that voice is a quite variable and easily replenishable quality in us all. We all speak to different people using different voices. And I never had one voice. I had a voice which I, as a Southern kid, talked to people in Michigan with. And I had another voice that I talked to my agent with. And I think we all do that. We all talk to our priest. We all talk to our therapist. We all talk to our loved ones with slightly different diction, slightly different sense of rhetoric, slightly different sense of what's trying to be put across. And those are qualities of human beings which translate naturally into the rhetorical niceties of fiction. So I never thought that there was only one way I could do things. I mean, I can go back to my pal Raymond Carver. When Carver was first publishing fiction in the United States in the middle 70s, people always saying, well, it's a Raymond Carver type story. Or you can say the same thing of John Updike, it's an Updike story. But if in fact you look at Carver's stories or Updike stories or Cheever's stories or anybody's stories over the arc of their life, as you said, 40 or 50 years, what you find is that their diction changes. The length of their sentence changes. The scope of what they imagine as intellectually possible changes. There's no reason why at the beginning of your life you should write one way and then write that way forever. So if somebody says to me, as sometimes people do say to me, I can identify a sentence of yours anywhere. I always say, no, you can't, because it's not my goal that you would be able to identify a sentence of mine anywhere. They mean it as a compliment, but I don't mean it as an insult to say that they're not telling the truth. I just mean to say that's never my goal. I want my sentences to change with the changes that have occurred in me. As you get older, maybe you get a little smarter. You also run out of material. So you have to find a style that advantages you with both of those things at the same time.
Yes. Yes. Now, you just mentioned Raymond Carver.
Yeah.
And you two have become kind of associated in the popular imagination. How did you meet and become friends? And what do you think is his legacy?
Well, the second of those two questions is I don't know, because it slightly dismays me to see my Columbia University students coming into my classes and they don't know him. They don't know his work, and that of course makes me sorry. we met just as one often does in the United States, or we used to before the COVID pandemic. We met at a festival just like the Cork Festival. He was invited to a festival in Dallas, Texas, and so was I. So was E.L. Doctorow. So was Tess Gallagher. So a bunch of people were, and we just hit it off. Turns out his parents were from the same part of Arkansas, the real backwoods sticks, as my parents. And while he lived in the Pacific Northwest, and at that time I lived in Princeton, New Jersey, we found that we thought the same things were funny. And we found that we thought what was good in literature was something that we both recognized. I loved his stories right away when I read them. He said he loved my novel, but I kind of think he really didn't even read it, to be honest with you. But that's okay. I loved him. I just thought he was an irresistible man who happened also to write irresistible stories. He had just gotten off of booze that year after quite a few years of being a pretty tough drinker. And all of his friends, as happens to people who drink a lot, were drinkers too. But Christina and I, my wife and I, were living at a perfectly nice house in Princeton, New Jersey in the suburbs, and he saw that life, which was not plagued by alcohol. We would take a drink, but we weren't in the bottle all the time. I think he saw her and me, and he thought, gee, I could have a life like that. I don't have to be, sleeping in my car. I could actually be owning a house and living there. And so I think there was a part of this, and I know this gives the lie to the romance of two writers reading. I think he just saw that I was bringing off something in the world, writing stories, writing novels, having a mortgage, owning a house, that he felt was important for his survival. So we sort of fell together in that complex way that people fall together, I loved his work. I loved him. I thought he was lovely, funny man. He liked me. He said he liked my work, whether he did or not. He liked my wife. Never hurts to have a wife that someone likes, you know that. So,
does it bother you, not just as Raymond's friend, but as a professor of and practitioner of the American story tradition, that your students aren't aware of his work, when many of them, probably without knowing or trying to write in a manner that he broke the ground of?
Yeah, it makes me unhappy. But a lot of my students don't know where Oregon is either. So in the hierarchy of things that my students don't know, they don't know what year the Declaration of Independence was signed. They don't know that there was once a war with Mexico. They don't know a lot of things.
Yes, but it troubles me that everyone seems to think now, younger people, and I know merely saying this starts making me feel like, get off my lawn. But it's almost as if nothing happened before 2007, that's the iPhone and Google and all that stuff. And so it's disturbing sometimes, and maybe we'll come back to that at the end of our conversation.
Let me just say this. Every time I walk into the classroom, at Columbia, I think to myself, and years ago when I would be teaching, I would walk into a classroom and I would feel, I'm you, you're me, we're basically the same. And now when I go into the classroom, I think, now what you're going to find out is that your grandpa is not as stupid as you thought he was.
Yes. I'm almost there, not quite, but so this is something else that I find interesting in your work. So you're one of the few major writers who has forcefully laid claim to more than one landscape. that helps provide mythic and contextual resonance to your work. I'm referring, of course, to New Jersey, specifically Princeton and the Shore, and to the Intermountain West, which Montana, Wyoming, all of that. Now, in stories in particular, you've written with majesty about Montana and the American suburbs, joining masters like Cheever and Updike, both of whom you've mentioned this afternoon or evening. Now, over the last 20 years, another landscape that seems to be emerging in your work is that of, in your story work, is that of contemporary New Orleans.
Yes.
Now, are you conscious of claiming these landscapes as your own? Or is it something that just happens as a residue of living your everyday life? And one other kind of parenthetical thing, the new book has a story set in Jackson, Mississippi, where you grew up.
Yes.
Might you write more stories set there? So I'm curious about this.
Well, it's a good question, and it has a lot of parts to it. But I'll answer it in the terms that you pose it. I don't claim these places at all. I appropriate their language. So I appropriate the language that is apposite to New Orleans, which in that language might be the names of streets, the street that goes by the river, which way uptown is, which way downtown is. And I appropriate the names of places because we're really talking about language here more than anything else. And as a poet, you understand that better than most people I know. With the Jersey Shore, I just want to get the names of places that exist in the Jersey Shore into my stories, because if I get this wonderful, rich language into my stories, then I can put in front of that language, in front of those places, behavior among human beings which can be seen to be more plausible because they take place in front of a realistic background. But it's not a claiming for me. It's an appropriation. But, and I know, at least in America, the word appropriation has a sort of a radiance to it. And I will appropriate anything that I want to appropriate. I will appropriate your culture, your history, your vernacular, and I don't mean necessarily yours, Anthony, but anybody's. I will appropriate it and bring it into my story as a way of making it useful to my story. So nobody's going to be able successfully to say, this is mine. You can't claim that, because I'm sorry, I just will. But it's a claim that is so provisional. It's a claim that doesn't last very long. It's just a claim that I make for the benefit of one story that I write or another story that I write. I can't bring New Orleans to the page. I can't bring Billings, Montana to the page, but I can bring its language to the page. And that's instructive because that's what stories are. Stories are language used in felicitous and inventive and interesting ways, but they aren't the place itself. I mean, if I write a story, which I have, and set it in Dublin, I'm not bringing Dublin to the page. I'm just bringing some places that I know and some streets that I know and some directions that I know, and putting in front of those places human beings behaving this way and that way.
Does that apply to even Jackson?
Jackson, I'll tell you a story which doesn't so much apply to Jackson as much as it applies to New Orleans, but the answer to the question is yes. Years ago, when I was trying to get myself free of being a Southern writer, I thought I would quit writing about the South altogether, in the sense that I would quit setting stories in Southern settings. And I didn't do that for a long, long time, because every time I would write New Orleans, I would hear Walker Percy, or I would hear Tennessee Williams, or I would hear Eudora Welty. And I wanted to strike that out of my auditory capabilities. I didn't want to hear that in my own stories.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, back in the late 90s, I was moved to write a couple of stories which took place in New Orleans. And I thought, well, am I going to hear all of these things all over again? And I thought, well, yeah, I might. And so I set the stories in New Orleans in a kind of neutralized way. I set them in an any place, not New Orleans. And then once the arc of the story was completed, I backloaded all of the New Orleans details and all of the New Orleans street names and how the air smells in New Orleans and what the sounds are that you hear. I backloaded that into the story and sort of dressed it up after the arc of the story was made. And while that in itself might or might not be interesting, it does point to the fact that all of these issues of place, all of these issues of where a story is set, whether a story is about the essential New Orleans or not, are really just pieces of artifice. That they exist as artifice more than they exist as actual places. It can be dealt with for that reason much more easily and freely.
Well, I find that very fascinating because I do think that these New Orleans stories reveal a New Orleans. For example, the Kenosha story, it doesn't have any of the usual New Orleans hugger-mugger, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You see a very different kind of, very contemporary feeling American landscape. You know, these faceless suburbs, you know, the stores that are monoculture everywhere. But New Orleans does come through. And so I find it very fascinating what you just said as to how you worked your way to that. And I think that that's one of the reasons. That's one of the things that excites me about your New Orleans stories, that they kind of allow me, and I'm speaking only for myself, of course, but it allows me to see New Orleans in a way that strips a lot of the lore that has come down over the years. So.
Nothing ever takes place on Bourbon Street in my New Orleans. There's no Spanish moss hanging from any of the trees. You know,
yes.
there are no whorehouses. There's none of that stuff in my New Orleans stories. But you know, I have to give my wife credit for this in a big way, because I was a kid in New Orleans, as you know, and all of that hugger-mugger stuff, that was really that was in me. That was in me deep, and I wrote part of A Piece of My Heart in New Orleans. And so it was there in me. But when Christina became the head of city planning in New Orleans, one of the things that happened to me was that I began to see New Orleans through her eyes. And through her eyes, New Orleans was just another big city with all of the big city problems and all of the big city characteristics and all of the governmental issues. And I was a little sorry about that because it was kind of getting in the way of my romance. But it stuck in me to think, New Orleans, you know, is a lot more like Cleveland than I ever thought it was. And
yes.
Very useful.
Yes, and that's part of what I mean, is that you start to see it through these news stories as another American place that is much more American than it is Southern. And
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it is true of it. It happens to be also true of it.
Yes.
You ask about Jackson. I'm so deracinated from Jackson. I mean, Jackson was where I grew up. Was such a dreadful place to live when I was growing up there. I mean, my parents loved me and I loved them, but everything else about it was pitiably awful. I mean, it was bigoted and it was churchy in a way that I couldn't stand, and it was absurd, and it was impoverished morally. So for me to set a story at Jackson, it's nothing. I could set a story at Jackson as easily as I could set a story in Moline, Illinois. It's nothing. It's really nothing to me. I made that break.
Okay. What about the novella? You've written a number of those, and many of them are quite astonishing in their own regard. The one about the trip to Paris that's in Men with Women is always stayed with me, for example. When you're working on a novella, do you think of it as working on a story that just happens to be long? Or do you approach it from the beginning as its own separate thing that now I get the novella box out, you know?
Yeah, it's that. It's really that. I'm so much disadvantaged when I start something and it metastasizes into something else. I don't feel like I'm running it properly unless I'm running it as what it is from the beginning. Because the longeurs of a novella are different from the longeurs of a short story, even a long short story, certainly different from a novel. And they have to be, at least if you're me, they have to be measured as you write it, rather than going back and sort of retooling it and resculpturing it once you have it in some amalgamated form, but without a real character. So for me, I really put on my novella writer's hat, and I think to myself, now I'm going to write a novella, and it's going to be, it's going to be 21,000 words long, and it's going to have this many characters, and it's going to take this long to read. So, but that also, Anthony, that comes from reading. I just, there are novellas in the world that I have loved, and so that form, that shape, what they used to say about novellas was it's a length that would let itself be read on a long train ride. If there are any such things as long train rides anymore, I don't know. But so I start off with the form, even though the form in American usage now is fairly free. The length is not quite as prescribed as it used to be in the 19th century.
Okay. Now, we have about 10 minutes left. So there's a question that I want to ask you that is more cultural than literary. Because I'm very curious as to your thinking, and I think people would like to hear. The question goes to some of the upheaval we're witnessing in North America at this moment, and it in many ways links to your comments just a few seconds ago about Jackson. Now, you grew up in the American South during both Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. You've seen a lot happen. You've seen a lot of change and a lot of what I would call backsliding. Do you have hope for your country in terms of race relations at the moment?
Well, that of course is the most important question you could ask anybody in America these days. There have been times in my life when I thought, no, I don't have that hope that there will be comity between the races, that there will be full equal access between the races, full tolerance between the races. Much depends on the outcome of the election that's in 3 weeks, whether or not we're going to see the continuation of the amelioration that has come along in racial matters most recently. Because I did live through both Jim Crow and through the 60s civil rights movement, I am a little more optimistic probably now that I've got old than I used to be, because I don't think race relations are worse now than they used to be. I think that certain aspects of them, and I'm only talking as a white man, I think certain aspects of them, partly because of President Obama's presidency, partly because of the Black Lives Matter movement, that the inequalities have been made more visible, made less tolerable, I think. But over the course of my life, I think things have got better between right between the races, and not just Black Americans and white Americans, but other ethnic orders as well. But do I think that in the long run I'm optimistic? I have no choice but to be optimistic. I can't hear myself say and believe myself if I say no. I just can't do that. And that may just be a foolish idealism on my part. My problem is to try to stay relevant at my age, to try to think that my experience is valuable to anybody, that what I have seen is worth even mentioning. So that kind of, I feel a little left out of what's going on, but I'm trying through the agency of writing stories just to keep my hand in. Your view of that would be more interesting than my view. What is your view?
My view would be, and this may sound surprising to some people, in the long term, I'm quite hopeful, partially because, as you just alluded to about yourself, my father was born on a plantation in the Delta in the middle of the Great Depression. And had a fifth grade education. Yet here I sit in New England doing my thing, right? That is tangible progress. I think that there is always this kind of backsliding. And I think that one of the things we're learning is that every inch of progress is going to have to be both fought for, but also defended. It has to be defended. That's one of the things that people younger than me that are starting to learn, that we can't just assume because there are forces out there that feel deeply threatened and angered by a centimeter of progress for African Americans or Latinos or whomever. So I think if you can assimilate that into your thinking, then I think you can see Dr. King's arc of justice bending toward good.
Delight. It means much more to me that you feel the way you feel than it means to me that I feel the way I feel. But we both have seen enough things go by the window to make us feel like there's reason to go on living. I mean, as a writer, imaginative writing is inevitably optimistic because it presupposes that there will be an audience someplace out there after today to read what we write and to make use of the things that we have thought. And that imaginative writing, the institution of literature, presupposes a future. And so on the strength of that kind of optimism, I can't feel differently about relations between human beings because I really can't feature a world. And of course, we will all be, limited by what worlds we can feature. But I can't feature a world in which worse happens all the time. I never thought this until now, anyway, when authoritarianism is right at our threshold. Because in America, we have authoritarianism looking us right down the gun barrel.
Sure, but in a way, part of what I think about that is an authoritarianism begins to take this beyond even racial matters, though I think racial matters are used to enforce and
they are indeed. That's a world we can't imagine in a way. The authoritarian world of the United States is a world we can't imagine. So we're beginning to have to think about it.
or anything about Americans that when they finally decide to get up and react, that they rise to the occasion, but it's like they wait until the last possible minute.
Well, this is the last possible minute.
Yes, and so we will see.
We
We will see. But I have to say, I feel like Trump's actions have much more to do with him being afraid to go to jail than any vision of taking over the nation.
That's what's driving the country is Trump's fear of going to jail.
Yes. So that's actually cheering to me. That is not some big master plot. It's just a malignant narcissist who's about to run out of rope.
Well, thank you, my pal. It's great to get to do this with you.
Yes. Speaking of the future, we have about 90 seconds. Do you see a future for the story, with these students of yours who don't know who Raymond Carver is, which in my mind is worse than not knowing where Oregon is, but,
Oh, sure. Literature grows in the cracks. I'm not worried about that. I'm not even worried about readership. The delivery systems are all going to be different. Stories are not going to come in little books like this. They're going to come in other packages. But the urge to write a story is as Sartre says, it's gratuit. It's both gratuitous and free. And I think that as long as it remains gratuitous and free, and even if some evil genie would come along like Trump and forbid anybody to do it, it's still going to happen. It's still going to happen. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about many more things than that. But that, no. People are going to write stories because it's easy. Hell, it's easy. If I can do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you for
Thank you,
your time.
my friend, and thanks to our Irish friends for putting up with this. It's a great honor to get to do this.